and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining. I want to start with just a few basic terms to make sure that we're all on the same page. The BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, is a movement. The modern boycotts have been going on against Israel since even before the state was founded, but the modern BDS campaign really crystallized around the turn of the century, around the what was known as the UN Durban Conference against Racism in 2001, which really morphed into an anti-Semitic hate fest, which served as a point for different groups to coalesce for this modern BDS campaign. Now, first as a researcher, and over the last 9 years in the government, and then now again as a researcher and a fellow, I've had the privilege of helping the Israeli government and the Pro-Israel Network develop its response to this challenge. And if we ask ourselves, what's the goal of the BDS campaign? The goal, there are two distinct goals that are related but distinct. The first being to harm Israel, to actually advance boycotts and divestments, to actually harm Israel's economy, to harm its ability to defend itself, and so on. The second is the broader and longer term goal of delegitimizing Israel, demonizing Israel, turning Israel into a pariah state, into a state whose voice doesn't even need to be heard in the international arena because Israel is so beyond the pale, such is in essence an evil, the essence of all evil, and therefore should not be listened to. Those are the two goals of the BDS movement. Now I want to start with the bottom line. The bottom line, and one of the main findings of my research, is that there's room for optimism. So the pro-Israel community and the Israeli government have been meeting this challenge for the last 2 decades, more or less. It took a while for Israel. There were obviously those who were early adapters, but it took a while for Israel to really identify, characterize this challenge, this new form of challenge. It's different than the regular military challenges, terror, and to organize itself, to develop the strategies, the tactics, to begin to work as a global network. And as a result, since it took a while, for the first, I would say, 10, 15 years of the modern BDS campaign, to a certain extent, Israel was caught flat-footed. And the BDS campaign was able to achieve a number of victories. It was able to appear as having potential of developing to a strategic threat to Israel. And I think what's happened, if you really analyze what's happened over the last 2015, certainly since 2018, is that the capacity building and the strategy development processes of Israel and the pro-Israel and the counter-BDS network have come to fruition. The strategies have been rolled out, and for the first time, the BDS campaign is on the defensive, and some of their achievements are being rolled back. Nevertheless, the BDS campaign has always had the ability to quickly adapt, to quickly pivot, to identify new opportunities. So the bottom line, and I'm sort of getting to the punchline at the very beginning, is that if Israel and the pro-Israel network, each one in its own proper area and respecting the differences and the boundaries, of course, between a government and organizations operating all around the world, if they continue to operate in a coordinated and sophisticated and synergistic manner, I think it's quite likely that we will be able to not erase the BDS movement. It's sort of like terror. It will never disappear, but we can contain it and keep it to manageable levels. Whereas, and this is something I'm a little bit concerned about, if we say, okay, you know, it hasn't had any major accomplishments over the last couple of years, I guess it's not a strategic threat anymore. If we take that approach, there is a chance that the BDS will develop, will expand to new areas, will develop new partnerships, and still has the potential for developing into a strategic threat down the road. So that's the bottom line. What I want to talk about, obviously it's a huge topic. It's a worldwide campaign in dozens of arenas, from campuses to unions, to churches, to civil society, to governments, to economics, to banks, to socially responsible investment. The BDS campaign takes place all over the world and in numerous arenas. We don't have time to discuss all of them, so I really want to focus on just a few trends and then talk about and a few trends related to the political governmental arena, because I believe that that is one of the main arenas that we are going to be seeing, the economic arena, and then talk about two areas of activities or two strategies that have been instrumental in putting BDS on the defensive over the last 3-5 years, and that I believe can be taken and further developed by all who want to defend Israel from this campaign. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, this is the report that we can see it. This is the report that I recently produced, where I said, there's been a lot of arguments, BDS bad, good, anti-Semitism, but really to look at what are the trends and what's on the horizon, what are the trajectories. So the first trend that I want to talk about is the political and governmental arena. And when I talk about the political and governmental arena, I mean 3 levels. The subnational level, states, municipalities, local councils, the national arena, parliaments and governments, and the supranational or international arena. There's a lot to talk about, but I want to focus specifically here on the UN and the EU. And I believe that in terms of the centrality of the arena, we're going to be seeing in the next couple of years a lot of focus on this arena. So I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up. BDS organizations are focusing on promoting their goals, their agenda, their decisions on the level of municipalities and local councils. We've seen it in the UK around 2010 and then 2014. Perhaps most prominently the Leicester City Council 2014, making decisions not to invest or not to purchase goods that are produced over the Green Line in the West Bank. We've seen dozens of local councils and regional parliaments in Spain adapting decisions, declaring them free of Israeli apartheid. We've seen other cities in Western Europe, Dublin, Oslo, Belfast, either attempt or actually adopt in one form or another some sort of decisions. And I believe what we're going to be seeing now is a move, we're already seeing, and we're going to be seeing much more, is a move from Europe to North and South America. And in this case, I believe that the experience of European lawyers will be very valuable in terms of helping the North American groups prepare, even though obviously each country has its own unique characteristics in every location. And why do they want to focus on municipalities? On one level, it's because it's relatively easy, because there's always going to be opposition members of parliament or opposition members of local councils, or it could be that the left-wing parties, the pro-BDS parties, are in control of the local councils, even if the national government has a different policy. And it can move fairly fast. Now, the reason I believe we're going to be seeing this more in North America, the BDS groups have been focusing very much on promoting their agenda under the banner of the concept of intersectionality. Intersectionality is not an anti-Israel theory. It's a theory that postulates that different systems of oppression are cross-cutting, are interrelated. But BDS is taking that and is using that to advance coalitions which will allow it to promote its agenda on the level of local councils. So one prominent one, for example, has been the Deadly Exchange campaign, and I'll show you an example of it. This is from the recent, after the murder of George Floyd. This is actually from a Fatah website, or Facebook page, but the image of an American police officer, the American police officer who murdered George Floyd, and the claim that Israeli, not only that Israelis are doing the same thing, right, one-to-one, you feel strongly about this, or you feel strongly about that, but the claim goes deeper. The claim is that U.S. police and U.S. police tactics and the issue of mass incarceration are largely because of training that U.S. police undergo in Israel. Now, of course, this is ridiculous, and it's true that there are delegations and interactions and exchanges between Israeli police, but they deal with things like, and I can say I was personally aware of some of these when I was also an advisor in the Ministry of Public Security. They deal with counter-terror, they deal with forensics. They certainly don't deal with any kinds of tactics like they are claiming. Nevertheless, BDS is using this to essentially hijack the BLM movement and to try to build coalitions and build support among other groups for their campaigns. And what we'll be seeing, I believe, are increasingly sophisticated attempts and campaigns to promote. So for example, I'll give an example of a campaign that already took place. In 2017, BDS groups tried to pass a BDS resolution in the New Orleans City Council. They were unsuccessful. So they changed tactics. What did they do? In January 2018, they promoted this decision. This decision doesn't mention Israel. It talks about New Orleans, consistent with its responsibilities, has social and ethical obligations to take steps to avoid contracting with or investing in corporations whose practices consistently violate human rights. Seems very positive, innocent, not Israel related. But as soon as we know that this was promoted by local BDS and national BDS groups together with local council members who were sympathetic, as soon as this passed, BDS put out press releases which reached all over the national media, claiming major BDS victory. And although the mayor-elect and some of the council members tried to deny it afterwards, we didn't know, we didn't realize, the council's PR firm put out a press release saying this decision was consistent with the BDS campaign. And this is the kind of challenges I think that we're going to be seeing more and more in Europe, but certainly in the US as well. Now, in all the different countries, we're seeing different ways in which the counter-BDS or the pro-Israel community has responded to these challenges. So for example, in the UK and in parts of Western Europe, there's been a focus on EU procurement legislation, national procurement legislation. In Spain, the focus has largely been on the violations of constitutional rights of the Jewish population, which feels discriminated against by these decisions. In America, it's been very much focused on community relations and explaining how this has harmed the Jewish community, We've also seen local councils being a center for counter-BDS activity. So for example, sometimes it's on the local level, sometimes it's on the national level. For example, we've had major cities in Germany pass decisions declaring that they will not, they are opposed to the BDS movement, opposed to movements that call for the destruction of Israel, and they will not give public funds or allow the use of public facilities to BDS or anti-Israel or groups that support Israel's destruction. Obviously in the UK, we had the Conservative Party manifesto. We had 2015, 2016. We had guidelines and regulations issued by the government against boycotts in local pension schemes and in public bodies. This was part of the Conservative Manifesto in 2019 as well. We've had states in the US, for example, Florida and South Carolina, that have adopted, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which includes hallmarks of the BDS campaign. So in any case, it's going, the municipal level is going to become a more and more central battleground. Now on the national level, municipalities are important, but it's the national level that really generates headlines and interests. What we're seeing is the increasing sophistication of BDS groups working quietly, lobbying, advocating for BDS or motions that will enable BDS or move BDS to the mainstream with senior members of parliament, with senior members of Congress. So for example, in the US, for example, there is a lot of headlines around Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, but actually a much more sophisticated BDS campaign is taking place where groups such as the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights and others work with senior members of Congress, especially Betty McCollum, you can see in this picture. Here we have a meeting of a number of pro-BDS groups, whether it's the US Campaign, the Friends, the Quakers, Amnesty, Defense of Children International Palestine, which is has numerous links to the PFLP terrorist group. And they're working quietly to advance measures that may not be BDS in themselves, but create the groundwork for BDS. So for example, conditioning US aid on Israel not using that aid to harm Palestinian minors. Again, talking about children, it sounds very understandable. Of course, what they don't mention is that the Palestinian minors who are arrested by Israel are very often involved in murderous terror attacks. It could be 16-year-old youths. and they're a prime target of the PA and Hamas's incitement in order to encourage them to carry out the terror attacks. The other, we've had very strong statements against BDS by parliament. For example, this is a resolution from May 2019 by the German parliament, where they stated, and it was supported by parties on the right, parties on the left, the Greens, the argumentation patterns and methods of the BDS movement are anti-Semitic. They went farther, it's a little bit hard to see with the small print, but this resolution says that the cause of the BDS campaign, not to buy Jewish goods, this is the German parliament, a cross-party resolution, are reminiscent of similar campaigns by the Nazi regime to boycott Jewish goods. Now, another implication of the fact that BDS campaigns becoming increasingly sophisticated on the national level is that while BDS will not determine elections, will not determine struggles between parties, between elements within parties, the situation regarding BDS can change very quickly, right? So, as you're all familiar with, if Jeremy Corbyn had won the general election, the general environment for BDS in the UK would have very quickly improved. In the lower corner, you see the leader, Pablo Iglesias, the leader of the Podemos party with the ponytail. In Spain, Podemos was until recently a fringe left-wing party connected to Iran, connected to Venezuela, essentially leading it and its affiliate organizations leading BDS in Spain, leading the Free of Israel Apartheid campaign. And now, in the most recent government, they are senior partners in the coalition because of coalition politics and the outcome of the elections. And the expectation even now, but certainly once the COVID-19 pandemic dies down, is that the environment for BDS in Spain will quickly improve. And what this also means is that for the counter-BDS community, when these shifts happen, whether it's between the far left and the mainstream of the US Democratic Party, between the radical and the pragmatic wings of the African National Congress in South Africa, the counter-BDS community worldwide needs to have the ability to quickly focus resources in order to help local groups that will suddenly be facing much more severe challenges. I want to, so that's on the national level. And finally, I want to talk about the international level. The UN has been a body that has sponsored BDS conferences, helped fund BDS activity, but I want to focus specifically on what is on the UN Human Rights Council blacklist, or their database of companies that contribute to the settlements. Now, what happened was in March 2016, the Palestinian Authority, other countries, and the network of BDS NGOs, which works closely in the UN and in the UNHRC, helped pass a resolution which said that asking the UNHRC, or the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to create a database of companies who contribute to the settlements. And the way this database was structured, and I'll explain this in a minute, reveals another sophisticated tactic of the BDS campaign. The smart BDS organizations understand that calls to boycott all of Israel have less of an audience in the mainstream. But calls to boycott the settlements, especially in the UN, can find broader audiences. So what do? They frame their calls and their activity in the language of settlement boycotts, but they work to expand the definition of what is considered connected to the settlements, so that encompasses essentially every Israeli company and almost every company operating in Israel. So if you look at, these are only a few of the criteria which the group that made the database used, you can see that include essentially all of Israel's utilities, transportation companies. I just want to draw your attention to the very last criteria here: captivity of the Palestinian financial and economic markets, as well as practices that disadvantage Palestinian enterprises. Right? Essentially, the claim here is that if a company, I don't know, a genetic drug company, just like it sells generic company, just like it sells its products all over the world, also sells its products in the Palestinian Authority, and therefore prevents the development of the Palestinian economy, that should also be on the UN blacklist. Now, to be honest, what a lot of people don't realize is that the blacklist that was published in February 2020 was actually, in a sense, a failure of the BDS groups, insofar as the committee didn't use any of the broadest criteria that they had inserted, that the BDS groups had encouraged and inserted into the language. And they included a relatively limited number of international companies, and most of the BDS campaign's favorite companies weren't included, the favorite targets, obviously. However, this is going to become an annual exercise, and this database is supposed to be updated annually, and BDS groups are doing two things. One is they are working now to add additional companies to the database, and whether or not their targets are in the database, some are, some aren't, they're then going to parliaments and unions and socially responsible investing consulting firms and saying, look, the UN says that anything that has to do with settlements is on a blacklist. These companies we claim have to do with the settlements, therefore they should be blacklisted. So it is already giving it's giving a wind in the sails of the BDS movement. I just want to mention very briefly, because we're also running short on time, the EU. Now, there's been talk, if Israel moves ahead with applying its sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, some have hypothesized that the EU may take dramatic steps against Israel, to sanction Israel. I think that's incorrect. I think that whatever requires consensus on the political level is not going to be possible because of Israel's close relationships with a number of EU countries. However, the EU has adapted the principle of differentiation. Differentiation means differentiating between its relations with all the territory over the Green Line and the territory inside the Green Line. Israel proper, the West Bank, as some define it. Now, this principle can be interpreted narrowly. For example, we saw the labeling requirement. We see products that come from over the Green Line do not enjoy tax-exempt status under the EU-Israel Free Trade Agreement. However, a number of the most sophisticated pro-BDS organizations are now working, again, to expand the meaning or the implications of differentiation. So if you take the most extreme examples, and I don't think we're far away from this happening, but if you look at the roadmaps that these organizations have published, they argue that, for example, European banks can't work with Israeli banks because there's no way of knowing for sure if funds from a European bank transferred to an Israeli bank might not end up somehow over the Green Line. And this is expanding the principle of differentiation can be done via the bureaucracy, via the DGs, the Director Generals. And I think this is also going to be a challenge that Israel will be facing in the near future. We're running short on time, so I'm going to just address one point in the economic sphere. And then if we have more time, hopefully we can go back, but it's also a very practical issue. In terms of economic BDS, the BDS campaign always prefers what I call low-hanging fruit. They will look for organizations, for example, that are subject to non-Israel-related boycott campaigns, for example, because they manufacture cluster munitions. They'll look for campaigns, they'll look for companies that have shown that they can be pressured, or in industries where other companies have shown they can be pressured. And a very clear example of this was G4S, the British security company, which is one of the earliest targets of the BDS campaign, where companies understandably would like to engage, they would like to dialogue, and they tried. G4S tried to, they hired experts to review their ethical activity, their legal activity, they had dialogues, and what they found is that the more they tried to come and approach and meet the BDS halfway, the wider and wider BDS demands grew until G4S, one of the few victories of the BDS campaign to date, did pull almost entirely out of Israel. Another important campaign I just want to show an example is the campaign against the bank HSBC. As far as we know, HSBC has not given into BDS. But here, and I'll show you, this is the website from the British pro-BDS group War and Want, a far left group, very involved in the BDS campaign in the UK. And they're updating about their HSBC campaign. Here, I'll read it because the letters are quite little, but they explain that, you can see in the middle of the screen, HSBC responded by asking for a meeting. And what do they learn from the fact that HSBC wants to meet with them? We took one clear message away from our meeting with the bank's executives. HSBC is nervous about the public response. And to us, that means one thing: time to increase the pressure on HSBC. The message that needs to go to all companies that are being pressured by the BDS campaign is don't give an inch. If you give an inch, if you try to meet them halfway, that is only going to increase the campaign. By the way, even after BDS claims victory, they find other excuses to attack the same campaign. They even demand reparations. The company pay reparations for its past activities. But if companies stand strong and refuse to give in, for the most part, the BDS movement moves on and looks for softer, other low-hanging targets. I want to talk just briefly now about, I see the time is running up and I want to leave time for questions, about two areas of activity that have been instrumental. First of all, on the political and economic level, there have been numerous tactics and strategies that have been developed. For example, on the economic level, Israel and various bodies in the pro-Israel community have greatly increased their engagement with the bodies that consult and recommend regarding corporate social responsibility, social responsible investing. So while in 2014, 2015, we saw these CSR and SRR bodies blacklisting Israeli companies, almost all those companies have removed Israeli banks, for example, from their blacklist because Israel and those who oppose boycotts have engaged, have explained Israel's positions, have explained the relevant legal and ethical aspects of the bank's activities. So there are a number of various strategies and tactics, both on the political level and on the economic level and on the academic level and the church level and other arenas, which have been successful in rolling back BDS gains. But I want to talk about two other areas of activity. The first is the connections between BDS and terror. A major effort has been, I think I'm going to jump forward here. This is something that the Ministry of Strategic Affairs produced in February 2019, has been revealing the connections between many of the leading BDS organizations and designated EU and US terrorist groups. And these are on three levels. One is the deep involvement of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, in many of the NGOs that are central to the BDS campaign. This is 17-year-old Rina Schnur, who was murdered on August 23rd of 2019 by Palestinian terrorists who were part of the PFLP. The commander of that cell was Samir El-Arabid, who at night was a PFLP terrorist. During the day, he was an operative or an activist or employee of Palestinian NGOs, part of Palestinian civil society that are central, in this case, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, you can see their logo, that receive significant funding from European governments. Just yesterday, the government of the Netherlands admitted that it was essentially paying the salary for this terrorist who murdered this 17-year-old girl. Just yesterday, the Shabak revealed that it had discovered another PFLP cell which had received training from Iran and Hezbollah and was planning to carry out attacks. So one is the deep involvement of the PFLP. The second is that within the body that claims to be and is accepted as the leader of the BDS movement, what's called the Palestinian BDS National Campaign, is essentially a coalition of various organizations. The very first organization that's in that coalition, I'm going to show you a screenshot from their website, is, you can see in the middle here, the Council of National and Islamic Forces in Palestine. This Council of National and Islamic Forces in Palestine was a body that was set up to coordinate terrorist attacks during the Second Intifada between Hamas and Jihad and Fatah. Now it mainly coordinates protests and riots and other activities, but among its members are these designated terrorist groups. And we've been working to bring the fact that the BDS campaign is led by an organization whose #1 member, in fact, his most prominent member, includes designated terrorist organizations, to the both to the attention of funders and to banks and financial accounts. So for example, you can see this is the financial platform Donor Box, which after we brought this to their attention, or not necessarily we, but after it was brought to the attention of Donor Box that the BNC, which was using this platform to collect donations, is connected, is deeply connected to this body, which includes designated terrorist organizations, they were forced to cut off their services to the BNC. And you can see here the tweet that they put out where they explained, because this group is part of the BNC, therefore we can no longer provide them services because of US counter-BDS organizations. The third level is Hamas affiliated groups, both in the US and in the European Union. I'm not going to go into them too deeply, but there are groups that are affiliated with Hamas, that are funneling money to Hamas, that are also involved in BDS, both in the US and in Europe. You know, I don't think we have time now, so I'm not going to go into BDS anti-Semitism, even though it's a very important, exposing both blatant anti-Semitism by BDS groups. For example, this is a tweet that was tweeted out by the leader of campus BDS in the US, Hatem Bazian, and promoting the widely accepted international definition of anti-Semitism, which is known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which has been adopted by over 20 governments, as well as by colleges and police forces and student unions. These have also been an important element in countering BDS. Why? Because the IRA definition includes examples, which include hallmarks of the BDS campaign. But the last thing I want to say before I turn over to the questions, I want to go back to the terror, is that to date, we have primarily been focused, the counter-BDS network has primarily been focused on bringing these terror connections to the attention of banks, of financial platforms. I believe there's a much broader range of bodies, whether it's subnational financial intelligence or law enforcement bodies, whether it's tax registrars, whether it's parliaments, whether it is various municipalities or other civil society bodies, which coordinate either with these terror-affiliated BDS groups or groups that funnel funds to these BDS groups. So for example, I talked earlier about the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. It was revealed that in the US, they're funneling money to the BNC. It seems like after that was revealed, they stopped doing that. But to go to all different, whether it's members of Congress or municipalities or civil society groups, and say, are you really sure you want to be cooperating with bodies that are either directly affiliated with terrorist groups, murderous terrorist groups, or they're facilitating funding for those terrorist groups. So I will stop here and open it up to questions. And thank you again to all of you.
Thank you, Asher. That was enlightening, interesting, and I know there's a lot more there, so we're going to tease out a lot more of it coming. We've got a lot more questions coming as well, which I just, another one just popped up. Let me get in first, and let me pick up on something you were just talking about, which I read in your report. The rebranding of the groups that coordinate. Please, can you just explain a bit more about that? Why is that happening?
You can explain what you mean to the terrorist and suits report?
Certain groups seem to be in running it. You talked about the BNC, and then it moves and becomes another group running it. Why is that taking place?
A lot of it has to do with the success in exposing the ties to terror and, to a lesser degree, the ties to anti-Semitism. So for example, a number of the BNC really, this is one of the things that I revealed in my report, is really a project of another group called the Palestinian NGO Network, which is leading the campaign against EU anti-terror clauses in EU funding agreements, not surprisingly. For example, there's the BNC, and the BNC has another body, which is essentially the same exact body. It's called PACB, which is the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott Campaign against Israel. And what's happened is that the BNC, for example, has now started operating using the PACB label. Because the BNC has been associated very successfully with terror, now all of a sudden all their fundraising is for PACB, it's not for the BNC anymore. And even more, a greater challenge is groups that are more sophisticated. For example, a very important group is Al-Haq. Al-Haq is a Palestinian legal NGO, which besides being very involved, for example, in the ICC and other cases, has also been doing a lot of the quiet work in convincing both the UN blacklist and other CSR and SRI advising bodies to blacklist Israeli companies. Now, the Israeli Supreme Court described the head of Al-Haq, Shawan Jabrin, as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as an active militant in the PFLP at night and a legal expert during the day. Now, Shawan Jabrin is not only the head of Al-Haq, he is now also has a very senior role in the leading French human rights organization, FIDH. So they have been successful in branding themselves as human rights groups, as civil society, and it's a major effort to reveal both their true nature and the true nature of their activities. So for example, we saw a few weeks ago a letter in Congress which said, it was initiated by AOC and Betty McCollum and a few other members, which seemed to say that if Israel annexes territory, then we should look at conditioning aid to Israel. But if you actually read the letter is creating the basis by saying Israel is committing war crimes already, and we should condition aid because of this no way to treat a child campaign, because of the Palestinian minors. So they're inserting BDS language into a seemingly innocent looking letter. So it's important to expose both the organizations and their tactics.
Something that came through very strongly from your report, to me, was a sense of something that I want to just reflect on you and see if I've picked it up in a way that it was meant to come across. That the BDS movement comes across as extremely strongly coordinated, well coordinated, with coherent and broad strategies that are enacted. And then the reflection of that is that those who attempt to counter BDS are localized and essentially firefighting and reacting to a local problem. And there doesn't seem to be any sense from what has gone in the past of a similar, or perhaps even enough, or when I say enough, I mean a strong attempt to achieve a similar level of coordination and strategy. Did I get that right?
I agree. Speaking of somebody who's in the Israeli government, there's an inherent challenge, which is that the Israeli government needs to be very careful to respect the legal and ethical boundaries and divisions between government activity and the activity of NGOs, civil society in other countries. So there is a limit in that sense, to inherent limit to coordination. But actually, I think that one of the reasons that we've seen an improvement in the counter-BDS network's activity since 2018, perhaps since 2015, is improving coordination. So improving coordination between legal groups, between groups that are active on campus. And I think that now, as trends move, for example, the trends of municipalities, or in a sense, the wave of anti-Semitism from all directions, moving from Europe to North America, there is certainly going to need to be a high level of coordination and synergy between these activities, between the activities of various groups. And that's really going to be one of the secrets, or one of the keys to either successfully rolling back and containing BDS or being less successful. Especially, I'll just throw it aside, on the municipal level, where there are so many different potential municipalities and so many local groups and groups with various local relationships, there needs to be a lot of coordination and sharing best practices, sharing information, sharing relationships, in order to successfully counter that.
I'm going to merge one more question from me with a couple of questions we've had from people viewing. Isn't there a danger that in presenting so strongly the narrative of BDS as related to anti-Semitism and to terrorism, that you simply alienate actually well-meaning people who currently support it? And tying in with something else you say in the report, you talked about something called the Overton window and reframing the narrative. So I just wondered, and that ties in with some of the questions we've had. Isn't there a danger of what I said, and how is the narrative reframed?
When you say the narrative reframed, you mean by the
more positive narrative?
Okay. In terms of the anti-Semitism, there's been a lot of debate over whether or not BDS should be termed anti-Semitic. And again, there's also a clear distinction between the leaders of the BDS campaign and the sort of rank and file, or the sort of, the people who jump on the bandwagon who kind of like the idea, who, might sign a petition or might go to a demonstration. There's absolutely a difference. And there's no intention of claiming that all of the supporters of BDS are anti-Semitic. But again, in my report, I focused on two elements which I think are undebatable. One being that again and again and again, we've seen BDS organizations and leaders cross the line into the most blatant forms of anti-Semitism. For example, in South Africa, BDS groups singing "Kill the Jews" outside of an Israeli concert. In Spain, an attempt to prevent a Jewish American singer from performing unless he condemned Israel. So I think there's a very strong basis for making that argument. And secondly, the IRA definition, which I think does a good job of encompassing all forms of modern anti-Semitism, whether it's classic anti-Semitism or left-wing anti-Semitism or Islamist, radical Islamist anti-Semitism, in its illustrative examples, clearly does include some of the hallmarks of BDS, whether it's denying Israel's right to exist, implying double standards to Israel, using Nazi imagery to describe Israel. So I think it's been the adoption of IRA, not necessarily related to Israel, because of the awareness of rising anti-Semitism, has been a positive development, and that has also helped clarify when criticism of Israel, which is obviously legitimate, crosses the line to delegitimization. And we've also seen numerous studies which have shown that when BDS, for example, is active on campuses, incidents targeting Jewish students, Jewish organizations also tend to rise. But I certainly, by exposing BDS connections to terror and BDS anti-Semitism, part of it is an attempt to say to the hangers-on or the soft BDS, criticize Israel, absolutely legitimate, but you don't want to be affiliated with this BDS campaign because this is their true nature. Now, in terms of reframing the narrative, this is an centrally important effort. It's actually, I can review it, something I've been discussing quite a bit, for example, with my former boss, Minister Erdan, who's now Ambassador Designate Erdan to the UN and then later to the US. There's absolutely a need to engage authentically and sincerely with all different societal groups, different campaigns, to listen. And I think one of the things that I've been very bothered by is attempts by some in the pro-Israel community, for example, related to Black Lives Matter, say, this is an anti-Semitic BDS group, we shouldn't be affiliated with it. I think that's a very wrong and inaccurate approach. I think BLM and other movements that we've seen in the UK and in other parts of the world are a diffuse and diverse body. Yes, there are elements that are extreme, that are anti-Semitic, that are anti-Israel, but there are many elements who I think is very important for Israel and the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community to be open to and to sincerely engage with. Another challenge is that we found, certainly in the Israeli government, and in this sense, the BDS campaign has been better than the counter-BDS network. The counter-BDS network has been very good on the legal level, on the political level, on some other levels. But in terms of social media and mass messaging and talking to younger generations, the counter-BDS pro-Israel network has just done a less of a good job. And I don't think it's an issue of not having a narrative. I think it's an issue of understanding the tools, understanding the messages and what works. And that's certainly an area that needs to be improved. But look, what I always say is that one of the reasons that I'm confident that BDS can be overcome is because it's just opposed to reality. What do I mean by that? Israel has many faults. There are areas that Israel needs to improve. There are strident debate in Israel and outside of Israel about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But the caricature and the demonization that the BDS movement promotes of Israel as really this essentially evil and racist entity, which anything good it does is just an element of washing, whitewashing, pinkwashing, greenwashing, in order to avoid attention to its evil machinations. That reality is that description is so distant from reality that, for example, as soon as we bring anybody to Israel and they spend a day in Israel, they realize that it's false. Now it's more difficult because of COVID, but that has been a major effort to just bring people to Israel. Say, come to Israel, walk around, no guided tours, just meet Israelis, see Israel, and you will understand the reality is so much more complex. And making clear that while BDS should be beyond the pale, should be seen as illegitimate, criticism of Israel should be seen as legitimate. Certainly the Israeli government has at times been better at that, at times been worse, and that's also something which both the Israeli government and mainstream Jewish organizations need to create that space for a criticism that stops short of BDS.
We've had a number of questions about the role of groups that identify as Jewish have in the role of BDS. A couple of the ones given were Yahad and Judas. How do you see that? I don't think you dealt with that in the report because that may be a localized thing. How do you see, do you have any views on those?
Very complicated issue, and I'm not an expert on Yahad. I know that there's been quite a lot of debate in the UK about those organizations that are very much on the left. What we've seen in some cases is this attempt to create a a dichotomy between the BDS movement in capital letters. So you have these left-wing groups saying, we oppose the BDS movement as represented by Omar Barghouti and by the BDS National Committee, but the BDS initiatives campaign, lowercase BDS, that we find acceptable. And in reality, that just doesn't hold up. And in reality, the BDS campaign is very excited to have Jewish groups that it can point to and say, look, we're not anti-Semitic, even though the most accepted definition of anti-Semitism says that we are. And even though you can point to all these examples of anti-Semitism, we're not anti-Semitic. How do we know? Because Jewish group A, B, and C has supported us in practice or in principle. So I don't want to speak to Yahad specifically because I'm just not an expert on their activity or their manifestos or their guidelines. But that dichotomy doesn't hold up in the real world, and more often than not, again, I'm talking about supporting certain forms of BDS. You know, what Peter Beiner, for example, before he decided he was in favor of binational state, he claimed that he was in favor of settlement BDS. Others, by the way, which have backtracked because they've realized that even that settlement BDS is just a gateway or an excuse or a mask for promoting BDS. That certainly is something that should be opposed, and BDS should be opposed in all its forms. Criticism of Israel, even strident criticism of Israel, is something that's legitimate. That's the bottom line. I'm
going to bundle a couple of questions together here. You've talked about some of the Palestinian groups that are coordinating this, but there are other international organizations which appear to have a strong role. One of the questioners asked about the Quakers. So I wonder if you could talk about some of the issues involving those organizations.
Absolutely. Many of these in BDS ideology or mythology, the BDS movement is led by Palestinian BDS groups, and it has to be, because if you have people in the West who are taking action, they can only do it if the local population, the authentic Palestinian, the kosher stamp, only if they're the ones who are giving the marching orders or giving the guidelines. But in truth, a lot of BDS activity, and some of the most sophisticated BDS activity, is carried out by strong groups. So you could have the PSC in the UK, the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers in the US, the various groups in France, Podemos, for example, in Spain, Podemos and affiliated organizations in Spain. And in some cases, they have local Palestinians who work for them. In some cases, for example, the American Friends Service Committee, their lead person is a woman named Dalit Baum, who started one of the most prominent Israeli BDS groups called Who Profits, which essentially serves as the research center for BDS. She's now moved to the US, and she now works for the American Friends Service Committee. So it's true that, and when we talk about connections to terror, we also like to point out that some of these organizations, these American organizations or British organizations, are opening the doors or facilitating the activity of BDS groups. For example, we saw a very fascinating development over the last year or two in the European Parliament and in Germany, where local groups brought PFLP-affiliated BDS activists to speak in the parliament or speak in public centers, and the European Parliament and the German authorities told these BDS activists, either in one case in parliament afterwards, in the German case while that terror-affiliated BDS activist was in Germany, we will no longer allow you to speak in parliament, we will not allow you to speak in public facilities in Germany. And this should be something that should certainly be highlighted. When local BDS groups act as door openers to parliament or other places for terror-affiliated BDS organizations, they should certainly be called out on that.
One of the questions just asked, if you could very briefly, just because you've just spoken about the German Parliament, EU Parliament, what was the nature of the German parliamentary decision on BDS and anti-Semitism? So
it's a fascinating case. In May 2018, a cross-party resolution is passed, which is like, as you saw, BDS is anti-Semitic. It reminds us of Nazi. Its argumentation patterns are anti-Semitic. It reminds us of Nazi campaigns. That followed similar decisions, and also the adoption of IRA by major cities, by the youth wings of political parties, by student unions, and this was sort of the culmination of that process. On the other hand, though, a coalition now of Palestinian and Dutch and EU pro-BDS organizations are pushing back. And they've challenged the number of the decisions in German cities, but it also has implications for the national parliament's resolution, where they've said this is a violation of our rights to free speech or assembly or equality. And courts have found that these resolutions are essentially declarative. So while nevertheless, cities, for example, may still have the right not to give public funds to these organizations, they may not be able, or they may not have the right currently to deny them the use of public facilities. And one of the questions facing German counter-BDS activists and organizations is, how do we shore up these resolutions? How do we convince the German government to adopt the German parliament resolution as binding policy? Obviously, there's a desire to do that. How do we make it now to something that's binding and that will hold up in court battles, some of which have been won by counter-BDS activists and some of which have been won by pro-BDS activists?
I just need to, I can see where the time is going. I can see how many questions we've got, and they don't match. So I just like to apologize for anyone whose question we don't manage. But moving on, there's a mood for sanctions at the moment against Russians and China, Iran. Are we seeing any attempt to link the BDS movement to that?
Well, the Palestinians have come out in support of China recently, so that's an interesting way of linking it. I would say one of the arguments that the counter-BDS community has always made is that in other territories that are considered occupied by the international or disputed by the international community, whether it's Western Sahara or Northern Cyprus, there's no UN database, there's no real EU differentiation policy, and why is Israel being held to a double standard? The case of Russia and Crimea is, on the one hand, interesting because in that case you do have strong sanctions, but on the other hand, it's something that I think also previous webinars that you've done have helped make the case for, and there's a strong case to make. The legal situation between Judea and Samaria / the West Bank and the Russian occupation of Crimea is entirely different. And whereas Judea and Samaria are disputed territories in which there's a strong argument to be made that Israel has the strongest legal claim, the case of Crimea is obviously entirely different. In cases which could be argued are more analogous, for example, as I mentioned, Western Sahara, Northern Cyprus, etc., there we have a clear example of double standards, where the EU policies and UN policies being applied to Israel or being discussed in Israel have not been applied. And to be honest, if they were applied, for example, if the UN blacklist included companies from other disputed or occupied territories, pretty much every major multinational, including many that are partially owned by European governments, would be on that list. So in that sense, there hasn't been a desire to link it to other cases.
Thank you. You've incidentally answered another question there, so that's good, about international law. One of the questions, and I think this may be the last one, we'll see how we get on, because it's quite a big one. One of the questions said that they see South America as the next battleground, as it were, in people who would like to challenge BDS. So Let me throw that to you, ask you, what do you see as the biggest challenge in terms of BDS? And another big question that goes with it, how can that be addressed?
So it's very interesting. We've seen basically a number of attempts, first of all, to import the Spanish from Spain, Israel apartheid-free campaign to municipalities or universities in South America and Latin America. We've seen, we had the Parliament of Chile, which adopted a resolution calling on the government to essentially adopt a settlement boycott. The government doesn't seem to be inclined in any way to adapt this. Here also, and we've seen attempts to connect to unions, to connect to universities. And here, again, it's crucial for pro-Israel and counter-BDS groups that have expertise and experience, whether from Europe or North America, to be able and to have the resources, to be given the resources to bring their expertise to help local groups, because there is a much weaker infrastructure and less experience among the Jewish communities and pro-Israel communities. So for example, in the case when a local council in I don't recall which Latin American country adopted this Israel apartheid-free, ACOM from Spain, along with local groups, were successful in pushing it back and convincing the Attorney General that this was a violation of rights, a violation of procedure, and essentially having it canceled. In fact, having a very negative statement about BDS promoted. But here again, as I said, this is one of the examples where the counter-BDS network, in order to be successful in continuing to roll back BDS and containing, needs to improve its coordination and synergy and ability to rapidly focus resources and expertise where necessary.
That's
so
great. We've run out of time, so I'm going to cut you off there because Asher's, I mean, he's given you a good taste for it there. All of Asher's points are available in the report that he's authored, and that's available on the website at the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs. There should be a link in that you're able to click on. And this talk is going to be available on the UK LFI Charitable Trust website and also on their YouTube channel. Let me give you a little bit of information before we go about the next webinar. That's going to be on the 12th of August. And that's going to feature Fleur Hassan Nahum, who is Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. And when I looked her up, I saw that she's the only British-born senior Israeli politician. That's what one website said anyway.
Born in Gibraltar, actually.
Oh, well, there you go. But with British nationality, I guess. And she's going to be interviewed by Natasha Hausdorff. That's on the 12th of August at a similar time. The title of that talk is The Application of Israeli Law in the United City of Jerusalem. And we are exactly to time, I'm pleased to say. And I'd just like to say, on behalf of the UK LFI Charitable Trust, thank you very much, Asher. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much to all of you.